Hey, this is Professor Keel. I wanted to talk about Hemingway for a while. We have The Snows of Kilimanjaro, that's our reading, but a little introduction on Hemingway before that. He's one of those writers now that's so absolutely famous and yet not taught by quite a few teachers that uh, people often know about him without ever having read him. And one of the things, at least that they think they know, is that he was, just a hard drinking, sort of hard partying macho guy, which in some ways he sort of was. But if you listen to people talk, often they have some real misconceptions. Like they imagine him being drunk and, drinking before he wrote or something like that. He tried very hard to be an artist, but he also wanted to live in a way that you could say was like a stereotypical man's life back then, right? So going hunting and fishing and being in shape, going to the gym, riding bicycles, boxing, all those kinds of things. He did them, and sometimes would try to get all of his friends to do them also. So that's a real part of him. Part of that's because of his upbringing. So he was born and he lived outside of Chicago in something like a suburb, basically, right? But it wasn't that far for him to go to get out to places where he could fish and camp. And he was raised that way to go fishing and camping, and they would his whole family would sometimes go for longer periods of time. So he got used to it. He got used to everything from rowboats to fishing and hunting and learning how to kill animals and things like that. So you have to imagine him being more normal than sometimes we think, in the sense that when he was at home and when he was going to school, he went to a high school not unlike most of us went to. He wrote at least a couple poems while he was in high school, and so he had some writing bug already in him. Now, when he graduated, though, instead of going to university, which is what almost all people now are pushed to go to, he actually went and became a writer, and that was at the famous kind of time in journalism where you're like the who, what, where, when, why. There's a discipline to writing. It's a spare style of writing. You don't put a lot of extra things in there, and you try to with an economy of words describe things to let your reader see what happened. And he took to that, and in all of his life, he never basically left that kind of idea. Once he moved to Paris, and that was after World War One. He'd been injured in World War One. He really did get filled with over 100 pieces of shrapnel, and it messed up his leg pretty badly. They had to put it back together. He was in the Italian ambulance corps, so he wasn't in the American group that was over there, but in the Italian ambulance corps, he would go back and forth, and they were fairly close to the front, and he eventually gets blown up more or less, right? And so his leg is all torn up, and he was able to carry someone to um, hospital, which means he was to maybe a medical tent or something like that, right? And then they eventually got to him, and he had to stay in an Italian hospital for about 6 months, and he fell in love with this young woman, and it was Agnes. And we don't know exactly the truth about this. We know he used that as a basis for his novel Farewell to Arms, in which a young American gets blown up, falls in love with the nurse, and she sneaks like alcoholic bottles in late at night, and so they party and they have sex together, basically. Well, Agnes certainly remembered him when people came back and asked her, but it doesn't sound like she fell as hard as he did for her. She was somewhat older, and so his crush was a lot more intense than we think maybe hers was, right? But he did stay there for about 6 months in convalescence, and he came back to the United States. So he had the experience that he gave to some of his characters, which was coming back from a war to people who didn't really want to listen and didn't understand very much. That's something that we commonly talk about now as soldiers returning, and we commonly talk about PTSD and issues like that. They didn't back then. There were names for it. It wasn't unknown. So, somebody might say somebody was shell shocked, right? And then over time, we added different names: battle fatigue, operational exhaustion. Um, but Hemingway knew it from real experience. He had seen people with it, and he had some degree of it probably. His best short story to read this is called A Soldier's Home. And in A Soldier's Home, not only does the young man come back, and the local girls and the other soldiers came back earlier, and they've sort of paired off and they're getting on with their life as young people. Krebs, his character, he feels it's too much to go through the social rituals, for example, to court a girl, when of course he had seen the war and he had probably been to prostitutes and things like that, and so it was just difficult to live those basic things, to get a job and that sort of thing. Meanwhile, his parents, who meanwhile are pushing him to get that job and to get right back into the normal swing of things. But we nowadays can feel what Hemingway understood back then, and most people didn't, and that's some of the kinds of shock that go along with being a soldier who sees active, duty. Uh, in A Farewell to Arms, it ends with a kind of tragedy. If you've seen the movie Silver Linings Playbook, the guy who gets so angry in the middle of the night and throws a book and yells and wakes his whole neighborhood up and stuff, that's the book he's reading, and he's angry that it doesn't end on a real positive, triumphant note. And I won't go into details on that, but Hemingway kept writing tragedies throughout his life. Some are, less tragic than others, but quite a few of the people that whatever they get involved with end up suffering for it. And that can be love, it can be war, it can be quote unquote sports, like bullfighting is sort of a sport, right? But the men that get involved in those things often suffer for it. There's a stereotype that Hemingway just loved that macho stuff, right? And that's sort of true in the fact that he did believe in doing those things. He respected bullfighters because he said that after the war, the only place you could really see life and death in a way was in the bull ring. And what he appreciated about it was a matador or a torero can get closer or stay farther away from the bull, and that's up to him. If he wants to be great and actually to show great courage, he's going to do things that let the bull come very close to him. On the other hand, a matador who has started to experience fear uses other sort of movements and stuff to keep farther away from the bull. And so Hemingway, watching countless bullfights, with others who love bullfighting, that was the kind of thing that they were looking for, to see if the matador was willing to get close to death. Hemingway liked other sports, and hunting is the other sport that he's probably most associated with. What we want to remember here is that he wasn't just famous as just a writer. His picture was in the paper. He had a knack for being in places where all the cameras were rolling. So when the tanks rolled into Paris, when France was liberated at the end of World War II, Hemingway was right there with that group that came in. He fought briefly a couple different times, and even when he really wasn't supposed to be fighting, sometimes he would get himself into the action as a journalist, basically, right? And you're not supposed to pick up a gun and join the fighting, but that happened a couple times. At other times, you see him living in the hotel in Madrid, for example, when the Spanish Civil War was going on and the bombs are falling out there, but he wanted to stay right in the middle and get close to it. So that was real. He was apparently a very good person in crisis. There's more than one story about him helping wounded, or even one about where his wife was dying, and the medical personnel, and I think this was somewhere in Illinois, but I'm not really sure. It might have been toward the Mayo Clinic or somewhere. But anyways, they were having trouble even resuscitating her, and I guess her veins had flattened, and he was able to get the needle in himself. So, he was a good person. Now, at the same time, he also was able to get involved in accidents, and he had more than one accident where not only was he sort of busted up from it, but his skull was, or his scalp was sliced. Sometimes his skull was broken, and one biographer said at least two of those occasions you could actually see his brain matter, that the wounds to the head were bad enough. That partially goes to something that's also a big part of his life, and that was his depression. His dad committed suicide. His mom, he thought, was overbearing in a kind of religious way that he got angry about. But he thought his dad was weak. His mom, in some ways, broke his heart, a lot of the biographers think, because when he started to get published, when he started to achieve some literary fame, she didn't like what he was writing. I mean, he wrote about people and loss of faith and sexuality and things that her religion didn't let her approve of, basically, right? So both of his parents he had some conflicts with, but his father committed suicide. Eventually, Ernest committed suicide also. He was at home and his wife wasn't there, and they hadn't put all the guns away, I guess. And he took one of his shotguns and supposedly put, maybe his thumbs on both triggers. So he put the shotgun in his mouth and killed himself. He was so famous that one of the people that remarked afterwards hated the idea that he committed suicide and wouldn't be allowed into heaven because he was Catholic. And so somebody made the argument that sometime between when he pulled the triggers on the gun and when he died, he must have regretted it, and that would maybe give him a kind of forgiveness so he could get into heaven later, or at least purgatory. But most people don't really think that way. We know that he was sick, that he had obviously felt the loss of his ability in the writing craft to concentrate, to write anything like he had written before. So the things that were published close to the end of his life were things that he had actually mostly constructed earlier, and they were just being finished off. The Old Man and the Sea, which ostensibly was the reason he got the Nobel Prize in Literature, was published. And it had been earlier a chapter for a longer book. And now, when you see it, we call it a novella because it's a very short novel. It is beautiful, and you can see why it got picked out. But when he got that Nobel Prize, everybody knew that, as often happens with people, that it wasn't really just for that one piece of work. It was for what he had done before. So he lasted until he was 60 something, and then he committed suicide. His granddaughter eventually, one of his granddaughters eventually committed suicide, and I think somebody else in his family too. So depression and suicide ran in his family. That's nobody's disputing that. Let's see, we're going to do the snows of Kilimanjaro, so I'm going to end this video, but one thing to know is that Kilimanjaro is a mountain in Africa. It's the highest peak on the African continent, and it does on many days show up above the clouds as if it's rising from the clouds. The story about the leopard and the idea that the cat is found on the slopes, I think might be apocryphal. It might be true, but it might just be something he used for dramatic and symbolistic purposes. The cat is a proud animal, a smart animal, and the concept of the man who's dying in camp having been someone like the cat who did try to reach up, and it doesn't matter. The world eventually got him before he reached the heights. As he's hallucinating and maybe even going in and out of consciousness during the long story, actually, that we're reading, he's thinking about things he'll never get to write. So he's thinking about experiences that he had always planned to put into writing, and maybe some of the way those things connect with each other. So one critic I remember reading once was talking about how the story felt sort of generous, as if Hemingway was giving away all of these little story elements or things that he himself could use at some time in the future, but now probably wouldn't because of the story. And he thought it was kind of a bit bold in the sense that Hemingway was confident he wouldn't run out of experiences and things to talk about in stories. So okay, so I will get back to you for another video talking specifically about Snows of Kilimanjaro.